Hi, everyone. So we are here for a very special edition of our Immersive Trails live stream. And this is a special live stream for Women's History Month. So I will give the floor to Barnali and Anirvan, who run Berkeley Radical South Asian History walking tours. I hope I got the order of those words correct.
Fine. I mean, a lot of words, so
it's a very long.
Yeah,
it's a very long title, and who are good friends of us as well. So, I'll give the floor to you, and I hope everyone enjoys. So there will be a short presentation by them, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion as well. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Immersive Trails, Chelsea, for inviting us to speak today. We're really excited to be here. I'm Barnali. This is
Anirvan.
Anirvan. And the two of us, we're the curators of the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. And we've been running this tour here in Berkeley, California. Some of you may be familiar with it because it has a really big university, or you might have heard about the free speech movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement. All of those movements have roots here in Berkeley. So we've been running the tours for about 8 years now. We've done almost 200 tours. And on the tour, we take people around the city of Berkeley, and we share stories of South Asian resistance and organizing that happened here, and share stories of people who led these movements or participated in these movements who have roots in South Asia. And when we talk about South Asia, we're talking about countries like Nepal, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, sometimes Afghanistan. So that general part of the world. And through these tours, one of the things we wanted to do is share sort of the deep history that our community has in the US, in California, and especially here in the city of Berkeley. And those stories go back over a century. So we share stories of freedom fighters who were based in Berkeley from the Ghadar movement. We share stories of feminists who took on labor trafficking in our communities. We share stories of queer activists, of youth activists after 9/11. And the reason we think it's important to share these stories is because these stories aren't very well known, not only in sort of the mainstream community, but also in our South Asian communities. And Anirvan can talk a little bit about himself, but I'll say that I grew up in Bangalore in India, and I moved here about 20 years ago to go to grad school at UC Berkeley. And as an immigrant, I've always sort of felt this tension of whether I would ever call this city home. And doing these walking tours, and part of that, I think, has to do with the way South Asians and Asian Americans specifically are welcomed as immigrants into this country. And it's not always very welcoming, to put it that way. So often we have to create our own narratives and understand our own histories to be able to feel at home here. And the walking tour is part of a longer effort, a longer journey in doing that. And I'll let Anirvan add a little bit more about himself and anything else you want to add about the tour.
Yeah, Barnali, she mentioned that she grew up in India, moved to Berkeley as an adult. I have a different story. My parents moved from Kolkata to North America in the 1970s. I grew up in the US, and I think we come to these histories a little bit differently. For me, it felt like my history was always kind of back in the homeland. It was back in India, and learning these stories of not just South Asians in California and the city of Berkeley, but South Asian activism and resistance, they really changed me, and they changed the way I think about myself and the city. And knowing that there's over a century of deep history here, it really kind of helps reorient a lot. So when we take groups of 15, 20 people through the streets of Berkeley, it's often this like really emotional experience where it is about the history, but it's not just trivia. It's something that really kind of speaks to people. And Kala Bagai story is something that is something that really kind of speaks to us. And do you want to talk just a little bit about the context of Kala Bagai?
Yeah, I mean, if to step back a little bit, and also to say that we're talking a lot about the walking tour. That's because it's very much connected to the Kala Bagai Way street naming campaign. Chelsea and Tatagat have been on this walking tour, and one of the things many people notice is that we are not actually pointing to places that still exist. Like often we'll point to a building that doesn't exist anymore. And that's because many of the places that were important to the South Asian community weren't really preserved. And it's not just the South Asian community. It's a lot of the minority communities that call Berkeley home. And so for us, when we do these tours, we often have to recreate the sense of place. And we do that through street theater. We do that through role playing. We do that through other interactive means that bring a place alive and help people connect it as a place of South Asian history. So when this opportunity came up to rename a street to rename a street in downtown Berkeley, in the heart of Berkeley, we started to think about it as an opportunity to share these histories with a broader audience, and also to think about whether we could reinsert some of these histories into the physical realm, noting the absence of these histories and markers in our physical realm. So if you're walking around the city of Berkeley, you would see very little that would indicate to you that South Asians have been here for over a century, or have been active for over a century. They've been in the US since at least the 1600s. So that's the context with which we started to approach this renaming campaign. Should I talk a little bit more about that process, or come back to it?
Yeah, let's come back to it. Okay. So I'm just going to share some pictures of Kala Bagai. So Kala Bagai was somebody who moved to California in 1915 from Peshawar in modern-day Pakistan. And actually, I'm going to just switch to a video that'll just give a little bit more context about who she is.
So we're going to show you a little bit about who Kala Bagai was, and then we will share our connection with the story, and then we will talk a little bit about what the city's process was like in sort of getting this done. I think the process will show you the complexity of some of these conversations that we've had to have here to actually get the street renamed. I mean, it's not a straightforward process, and we had our own approach to that. So it's important, I think, before going in, that you understand who Kala Bagai was and sort of the impact of her story, and why we chose to nominate her for the renaming.
So that video, it's from the South Asian American Digital Archive. And for folks who don't know, the South Asian American Digital Archive is based in Philadelphia in the United States. And over the last decade, what they've been working to do is really collect and share stories of South Asian Americans. And the challenge for a lot of us is that we often don't know our own stories. I remember when I started learning about South Asian American histories in the San Francisco Bay Area for the first time, I was just so frustrated that like I hadn't been taught these stories in school. My parents hadn't taught them to me. And I remember going up to my mother and being like, why didn't you tell me that we actually have we have like 100 years of history in this city? And my mother was just like, nobody tells you that you have these histories the day you get off a plane. So we're really reliant on the work of Asian American and South Asian American historians to actually kind of make these histories available. So Kala Bagai's family lives in the U.S. Her grandchildren are here on the west coast of the U.S., and they've been working with archivists from the South Asian American Digital Archive and others to actually get her materials backed up and preserved and really documented. Through that process, her story has been written about by historians like Erica Lee, a really prominent Asian American historian. And the folks at the South Asian American Digital Archive, they've been working really hard over the past decade to not only start collecting her materials, scanning them, digitizing them, creating videos like the one you saw, and kind of putting her story out into the world. And I think for us, it's been this really fascinating process of watching it go from like a set of her papers sitting in boxes through to history books and to something that we discovered. And Kala Bagai's story in Berkeley is it's a little bit complicated because she, like the video said, tried to move to Berkeley with her husband and her children in the late 1910s, and they bought a home here. And so there's Kala Bagai, her husband Vaishno Das Bagai, and their children, and they show up at this home that they just bought with all their worldly belongings. And they try to enter, and the door is like literally barred. They can't get into their house because the neighbors are stopping them from entering. And they have this moment of trying to figure out what they're going to do. Are they going to try and actually like enter this home they bought? Are they going to force their way in? And Kala Bagai makes this decision at this point in time for her to be like, no, like I am not moving into this racist neighborhood where I cannot keep my children safe. So she and her husband, they make this very like concerted decision that it's actually safer for them to move back to San Francisco, where they can be safer. And they end up building their life for the next several years in SF in San Francisco. So her connection to Berkeley is actually a little bit tenuous. She's somebody who wanted to move to the city, but wasn't quite able to because of racism in the city. So I think for us, her story is not a typical story of, like a local girl does good or kind of longtime community activist or whatever else. She's actually somebody who wanted to be part of here and wasn't able to because of us, because of the city's sort of really kind of dark histories of xenophobia, exclusion, anti-outsider racism. So the larger context in the US for renaming over the last like several decades is that most names in the US are very much names kind of put forward by the dominant community. So typically white landowning men are the people whose names usually get put on everything. So it's very much it comes from the Black Power movement, comes from movements of the 1960s and 70s and onwards, where there's a lot more kind of efforts to take back streets, take back the names of institutions, to start having the names that we put on things reflect the stories of women and queer people, and just like so many different kinds of groups whose stories have not been told. And Kala Bagai's story is a little bit very much kind of following that tradition. Now, in the city of Berkeley, Berkeley is one of the most liberal cities in the United States. This is a little less uphill. Right now, like nationally, there's a lot of kind of debates around statues of Southern Confederate war generals, around whether it's appropriate to honor slave owners, for example. And so things like that in historical memory, they're very charged. In the city of Berkeley, they're actually much less charged, and there's much more okay to rename things. there's still a lot of kind of contention around it, but people are very rarely actively hostile. So that's a little bit of the general context. Do you want to talk about like this street renaming in particular?
Yeah.
Actually, move forward from here.
So,
oh, and just to add to that, the one thing of Berkeley and Asian American names in particular. So Berkeley is a city that's over 20% Asian American, and in a normal situation, and obviously 50+ % female. And in a city like this, you would expect that 20% of names would be Asian American and 50% of names of things would be female. And that kind of wasn't really the case. That obviously hasn't been the case. So there's that piece. And right now, like the US is very much as part of a centuries-long period of really grappling with our history, particularly around kind of lines of race. And Berkeley is not special. We are a liberal city, and yet, just like a lot of other cities, we have these dark histories of anti-African American, anti-Asian housing discrimination. And Kala Bagai was somebody who actually faced that in a very direct way, not in kind of a big structural way. So for us, it's actually really meaningful to try to name something after her.
Yeah. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the city's process and how we got involved. Because we can have all of these ideas, but none of them work unless there's some kind of functional path to getting there. So I first heard about Kala Bagai's story and her connection to Berkeley from an oral history interview from the South Asian American Digital Archive that Anirvan talked about. And the Berkeley part, it's a small part of her overall story. I mean, you saw that, she lived until 1983, died at the age of, died in her 80s. So she had a long life here in the US. But in her oral history, she remembered very clearly that moment in Berkeley where she was made to feel afraid for her children because of the racist neighbors who kept the family out from moving into their home. And the reason they wanted to move there was probably because they had a lot of friends in Berkeley. Vaishno was part of the Gadar movement, and there were many Gadarites who were headquartered, who lived here in Berkeley, maybe went to school at UC Berkeley. And when I heard her talk about that, in 2013, I felt very haunted by that story, and continuously sort of remembered that feeling of being unwelcome or being pushed out from the city. So that was definitely something that had we had that had hooked onto us. So when in October 2019, the city decided that there was this two-block stretch in downtown Berkeley, which is the heart of Berkeley, that they wanted to embark on a renaming campaign. And the impetus for that was mostly around wayfinding, because it was just confusing. The names around there were very confusing. So they were like, we want to come up with a new name that will make it easier for citizens and people to visit that part of Berkeley, make it easier for businesses. But while we do that, we'd also, like it if it was named after communities that are underrepresented in Berkeley. So we were like, oh, this sounds great. Should we engage in this? And I remember going to that first meeting, and the process that was laid out was quite, I'll say, complex, and also would take a lot of time. And processes should be deep, they should be wide, they should be broad. The fact that we even have a public process, having grown up in India, one of the main reasons I came to the US to study city planning and landscape architecture was just because I was so impressed with the fact that there was a place where the public could make their opinions known. But it also seemed like a really long process, and we weren't sure whether we should be part of it. But we really couldn't pass up the opportunity to share our stories. And so we started thinking about who might be appropriate, who were the people that we might nominate. And there is no dearth of Asian Americans in Berkeley that we could nominate to have the street named after. But we also wanted to recognize that, as Anirvan said, there's a lack of street names after women, and there was definitely a lack of street names after Asian Americans and also South Asians. And one saying I've often heard in Berkeley is that Berkeley likes its famous people. So it was very possible that the street would get named after somebody who was famous, but it wouldn't really challenge the city or teach the city anything about its sort of darker history. And especially when it comes to Asian American history, there is still a lot of misunderstanding of the kinds of racism and oppression that the Asian American community has faced over more than a century. You see that now with a lot of the anti-East Asian attacks that we're seeing. The most recent attack in Atlanta of the 8 people who got murdered, 6 of whom were Asian women, 4 of them were Korean. And people often don't understand that our communities have faced oppression. And we wanted to share the story of somebody who had faced oppression, who had resisted oppression, and who had survived oppression. And the fact that she had not been able to make a home here meant that our campaign started sort of centering around Kala Bagai, and the campaign became a way to bring Kala Bagai home. And this, we wanted to do it in a way that made sure that we involved a lot of people, because our primary objective at that point was to be able to share these stories. We didn't really know if we would be successful. So we first brought on other community members on board, people like Manisha Bajaj, who is a professor at USF, a university here, who talks about like ethnic, the importance of these histories. And most importantly, we wanted to make sure that the family was okay with this, because it's not an easy thing to have your family's name and story be exposed in this way. It really makes you vulnerable to criticism from people. So we worked very closely with Rani Bagai, Kala Bagai's granddaughter, who lived in Seattle. And we started off with a letter campaign where we asked our community members to nominate Kala Bagai as somebody who the street should be named after. We wrote op-eds in our local newspaper, and the op-eds brought together housing activists, folks who are working today to make sure that those who want to live in Berkeley can live here. And I think for us, that's really important, to connect these old, histories to what's happening in the present. It's really important to make those connections and meaning making, because we often use history as a way to power us and to give us an understanding of how to fight injustice in today's world. We also made sure that at every public meeting there were community members who showed up to testify, to explain why this was important to them as a parent, as a Berkeley resident, as a young person living in Berkeley, as an Asian American living in Berkeley, as somebody who's Black living in Berkeley. Why was it important that Kala Bagai's story be honored and shared and marked on our streets? And you'll see in the map, I don't know if you can see it, but COVID happened somewhere in the middle of that, and a lot of the public process moved online, which actually was really great for us. It made the process longer, but we were able to then hear directly from Rani Bagai. Rani lives in Seattle, and if we had only in-person process, she would not be able to speak. And we were definitely sharing her letters and having and she was writing op-eds and support, but it was really powerful to have her come to the city council meeting, come to these committee meetings, and be able to speak directly. Another significant moment that I want to highlight was the support that we received from our Indigenous community. The Indigenous community is complex, but we wanted to make sure that we honored the original inhabitants of this land. So we talked with Corina Gould of the Lishan Ohlone, who are one of the most active folks here in the city of Berkeley, and made sure that we got their blessing for these names. It was very moving because Corina got the connection and recognized the need to honor folks who had, Kala Bagai and Vaishno, they were trying to flee British oppression and trying to make a new home for themselves here, while also trying to take down the British back home. The need to honor the stories of people who had sought refuge in the US. And those were some of the significant moments. And then in September 15th, 2020, and 2020 was a very challenging year. And this was one of sort of the very happy moments for us when City Council would go on to approve Kala Bagai Way because of the consistent community support that the name had received throughout the process. We then worked to create not just a street sign. And having a street sign, it's an ordinary piece. Most of us often will not look at it unless we're trying to get somewhere. But for those of us who know the story behind it, just this regular piece of street infrastructure feels really powerful when it has the name of a South Asian woman. But we also recognize that we needed to do more work and continue to do the work of sharing the story. So we also worked on a bunch of on having street banners that could speak to who Kala Bagai was, that was instantly recognizable as somebody who was brown, who was South Asian. And also we could talk about celebrating the larger history of Asian Americans in Berkeley. And it was a really sort of poignant moment when the street sign was unveiled, when the banners went up. And now Kala Bagai Way is just a street that, we go to when we go out for our walks or when we get dinner with friends. So I'll stop with that. And
one thing I'll add is that this is very much a broad collective effort. We were two of the core organizers. We mentioned Manisha Bajaj, but we're also working with historians and archivists, people like South Asian American Digital Archive. We were working with a family. We were working with local Asian American South Asian groups like the Alliance of South Asians Taking Action, as well as just lots of community members, parents, just residents, non-Asian American neighbors. I think in total, there were at least 350 people who were very actively involved in terms of writing to City Council in favor of this. And they really kind of came in with a lot of different kinds of angles. I mean, for some of them, it's about like, I want my children to grow up seeing the name of a South Asian woman on the street and like how important it is to actually see herself reflected in the city. For some people, like housing activists, it was very much kind of a political issue to name. What does it look like when people are kept out of the city? Who are these people who would have been our neighbors, but we didn't allow to be? And I think there's something really interesting about the idea that Kala Bagai is somebody who we can kind of all kind of put our find our connection to and really kind of go from there.
Yeah. I think we can maybe stop and see if there are any questions, or Chelsea, if you want to help us speak a little more to topics that you think might be of interest to folks.
Yeah, so we have one question. I'll put it on the screen here. So Suri says, your initiative to name the street is fantastic and the community effort is apparent. So many community efforts fall apart or fizzle out. According to you, what does it take to keep the momentum of a community effort going?
Organizers.
Yeah. Well, organizers for sure. I mean, you definitely, did you want to say anything about that? I mean,
no, go for it.
I can say, so I'd say it's a few things. It's making sure that you have lead organizers who are continuously tracking the process and making sure that folks who are interested have a way to engage with it. I mean, that was our main job, was we knew there was interest, and we provided lots of different ways for people to engage, whether it was through the letter writing or through the testimonials. But I think it also, this is a process document that you saw. It didn't start when the street naming process started. It started all the way back for us in 2012, and we would say all the way back to the moment that the oral interview was uploaded to Sada, all the way back to when somebody even, chose it, that oral interview was done a year before Kala Bagai died.
That was
I mean,
like 1982.
right.
Yeah.
This story would not have been known if somebody hadn't sort of done that oral interview. So just recognizing that sort of long history of organizing that it takes to get us to this moment. The other thing I'll say is, for me, definitely, it was just an understanding of the city's process. So making sure that the way we engaged really honored people's time and made the way they engaged very effective and efficient for them. Because city meetings, they're at dinner times. There are times when people are taking care of children. There are, during COVID, especially difficult time for a lot of folks, who might be suffering job loss or may not have internet to engage with these meetings. So for us as organizers, it was really important that we understood what kind of action the larger community needed to take to be involved and to do it in a very sort of guided and precise manner. And a lot of that happened because both of us, we've been part of commissions and committees and testifying ourselves on other issues, not just related to the Kala Bagai Way campaign. And then I think it's also the power of Kala Bagai's story that motivated a lot of people to stay engaged. We had taken on a very sort of paradigm shifting, challenging narrative. We were basically saying that this was a person who didn't really live in Berkeley. Usually when you have naming, it's like, this person won an award, this person won political office, this person lived in Berkeley for like 50 plus years. And what we were saying is, we want to name it after somebody who didn't get a chance to live here. So it was a lot of education. I mean, I think people still need a little bit of time to sort of switch to that mode. But we're hoping that, we're going to continue telling the story so that would happen. But the power of her story, the power of hearing her say in her own words how she felt at being pushed out of the city, I think is really important. And I think it helped us that, Vaishnadas Bagai's story was actually much better known because of the fact, also because of how tragic that story is. Somebody who moved here to the US with his family to take on the British, but also wanting to make a new life for themselves here. That's something I think a lot of people recognize. But then ending in this tragic way, and of having to take his own life because he felt so trapped here. And I think a lot of people sort of recognize that struggle even today of coming here as immigrants, of wanting the American dream, and then sort of recognizing the reality of both local racism that we face and federal racism when it comes to immigration. I think the power of the story also really helped push it forward.
I mean, and I'd add to that relationships, the relationships that the family had with historians and archivists, the relationship that the historians and archivists had with community-based activists. In Berkeley, the fact that a lot of activists are not separate from the community, but are very much organizing within the community. The people with kind of a knowledge of city process are very much kind of within that community. And the fact that we're all kind of talking behind the scenes and we can call on each other is really helpful. So even though the process of winning a Kala Bagai Way, like it was 12 months or 14 months of work, it kind of builds on like at least a decade of relationship building.
And I think relationship building translates to trust, where we could get on the same page about strategy or what we would say much more easily. So sustaining the campaign becomes much easier when you're working with people that you work with over a longer period of time.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I have a couple more questions for you, not ones that other people have asked, but which I'm interested in. So the first one is, what's next for you?
Yeah. I think for us, we hope that these two blocks in downtown Berkeley can become a sort of place of pilgrimage for a lot of South Asians. especially after COVID is done, we see it as a place where we can continue to tell, more story. I mean, Kala Bagai's story is not the only story, as you know, of this place. In fact, the story of Kala Bagai, I became more aware of because, and it sounded so familiar because before that, Anirvan and I had heard about George Shima, who was a Japanese farmer who was, faced similar discrimination in another neighborhood in Berkeley. And the map that Anirvan showed you of anti-Asian housing discrimination that happened all over the city. So we want to be able to continue to talk about that and talk about, the larger narrative. And we're hoping that this street allows us to sort of do that, and to do that also in as a physical place. The UC Berkeley campus is just a couple of blocks away, and we know that one of the folks who testified talked about how it was so powerful to be able to see a South Asian community activist and a community builder be named on the streets and feel like activism was part of their culture, because that's also something that a lot of students who move here don't necessarily know about. Will renaming one street do that? By itself, it won't. So you need sort of continued and sustained engagement from that larger community in telling these stories. So we've done the banner, and we're hoping that we can do some kind of plaque or sculpture that helps us push that narrative more. So that's what we're hoping comes next, along with some active events and storytelling that we can do on the streets once COVID is done.
And the
Not already 1920s work?
Yeah, well, in a sec. Yeah, one of the things that I know makes me happiest is the fact that this is about Kala Bagai in specific. It is about the representation of women and Asian Americans and immigrants and religious minorities in general. But these stories are not trivia. They're not. It's not just about putting the name of somebody up on a street. It's also about like pushing a narrative. And one of and it's been really exciting to see people sort of see her story as part of like a larger set of issues kind of happening in the city. So the city of Berkeley is dealing with a lot of issues around zoning and housing and race and history. And these are actually like very deep political issues within the city of Berkeley, about whether newcomers whether we make space for newcomers to live here. And it's been really exciting seeing members of city council, seeing our mayor really engage with both the Kala Bagai naming and that process, and also continue to do the work to make sure that newcomers are welcome and we make space for them.
Yeah.
And to see a city council person, in fact, Rashi, who was the first South Asian woman on Berkeley City Council, very specifically cite Kala Bagai and be like, that this is not symbolic. The way we do this is by allowing parts of the city to be denser to make room for more people. I mean, that just makes my heart it just like fills my heart to know that our stories aren't trivia.
Yeah, because Berkeley presents itself as a sanctuary city, to welcome undocumented folks as well. And I think our goal as citizens in Berkeley is always sort of holding the city accountable to the promises that are made in how they're going to make that a reality. And I think what's unsaid is that a lot of this has to do with race and who got to live in the city for so long and who didn't. And now that things are shifting, how do we make sure that that's that it doesn't remain in that way? Because I will say the population of folks who identify as white in Berkeley has not changed over the years, but we have lost a lot of our Black community, for instance. So we have a lot of sort of deep thinking to do about the ways in which who are the new Kala Bagais that are being kept out of the city. And what does it mean for the city to lose? Kala Bagai went on to become this amazing sort of community builder and contributor. And we think about what it would feel like if she lived in Berkeley instead. It would only be a benefit for the city. So we want to continue to sort of build on that for this campaign. And of course, we're going to continue to do our walking tours, and Kala Bagai Way will probably be a new stop on the walking tour now.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that we're fans of immersive trails and the work you're doing, because I think something that
thank you
we're all kind of figuring out together is that it's not enough to just talk about history, that it's connected to people and communities. And I'm thinking about your Chinatown work, for example, of working with people around livelihoods and storytelling and feeling ownership over stories. And it's a lot more complicated than what we thought when we first started running walking tours.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about the process of documenting some of these things, because as you said, it's the actual documentation that is important, and that happened in the 1980s, started in the 1980s, and has moved on from there. So we're currently working on a couple of different projects where we're trying to do some community documentation. One is with the Sidti community, which is people of African descent who live in India. There, we're working with several scholars and community members from there to try to create some sort of archive of their histories. And then also we are doing something with the Chinatown here as well, kind of building on our past, our past research with them. So I guess my question for you is, how would you suggest, like, what are some tips that you would have for how to go about reaching out to people, gathering this information, and making it public as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the public part is where a lot of these projects fail. And so in the case of Kala Bagai, for example, the oral history interview with her was done by a family member in 1982. She passed away in 1983. The recording was there, but it wasn't until maybe, I want to say 2010-ish or so, that maybe 2011, 2012 or so, that that recording was actually made public with the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is important, and that's very much about preservation. But something that we really admire about the South Asian American Digital Archive, SATA, is that they saw something really exciting about that story. And, they have so many different stories in their archives, and they picked out her story as one that was really important. And they made that video about her. They started talking about her, and really kind of taking ownership over that. And the fact that they were able to push it to the point where activists like us could, they tossed the ball, we caught it. And we have a street name in Berkeley, 2 blocks, named after Kala Bagai because of, I want to say maybe 60 or 90 seconds in an oral history interview from 1982 where she talked about her experience in Berkeley. That is a connection. If those 90 seconds of tape didn't exist, we would not have a street named after her. And so I keep thinking about the dissemination piece and how critical that is. And without history organizations that really believe in putting out the stories and doing the meaning making, something fails.
Okay. Can you talk about your work though?
Yeah, so one of the pieces that I've been working on recently is focusing on histories of South Asians in Berkeley from over a century ago. A lot of our the stories we tell on our walking tour and elsewhere, some of them are relatively recent. I mean, they'll go from maybe 1908 through even after 9/11, after 2001. And Chelsea, you've been on the tour and you've kind of seen us do the arc of some of these stories. But right now, I'm really deeply obsessively focused on trying to document every single South Asian in the city of Berkeley between 1900 and 1920 or so. And I think in my head, there were there are people like Kala Bagai, in my head, there was 30 or 40 of them. And I think we've looked at 80 different sources so far. And I think there's something like over 150 South Asians in the city of Berkeley that we found. And the stories of the people that we found, they really kind of, they messed with my idea of what the sort of the immigrant community looked like. Yes, Berkeley is the site of a major university. So there were a lot of students here. There were activists or members of the Ghadar Party working to overthrow the British Empire. But there were also servants. There were railroad workers. There were fortune tellers. There were concrete workers. Just really different kinds of stories. And I think we're at that moment right now where we're just starting to do that that work of finding these histories. And after we find a document, then we're in the much tougher position of doing the meaning making. And we know that we haven't done the meaning making work yet. So it's entirely possible that the benefits of doing this deep research work, probably, maybe we won't see it for another decade plus.
But I think what's so important about some of the more like local work or the work you're doing with the Chinatown community, for instance, or even the city community, I think for us here, the context is a little bit different. But I think what's been really interesting for me is focusing on, ordinary people, normal people's histories. Like in architecture, we often, have sort of monuments that we study, or these grand places. But then we also study what we call vernacular architecture, which is like houses and how people lived in community and how courtyards developed and what local materials they used. And it really gives you a feeling for sort of the weave of the community at that time. And, Anirvan is doing sort of this research of like mapping and finding these stories. We're still trying to figure out what the weave looks like, what the connections look like. But I think it's so important to know how ordinary people lived, because that can be very illuminating. It's not just how famous people lived, it's also how everyday people navigated the city. Like, we don't have answers for what people ate, for instance. Right now I have access to like Indian groceries so easily. What did people do at that time? And to that, I would say one of the most interesting things that have come out in the last year is actually fiction that's based on these histories. So a book we read recently was called Passage West by author named Rishi Reddy. And in that, she speaks to sort of sets the story of Sikh men in the early 1900s who moved to California, who settled in and became part of sort of the farming community here, their relationship together. And one of the most beautiful things about that book, which is, uses fiction as a way to talk about these ordinary lives and the emotions that these men who are leaving British India and moving here and forming communities with, say, Mexican women or the relationship with other Sikh men from that time. It's so beautiful to be able to access that, because feelings and emotions is not something we often talk about when we talk about historical communities. So I think well-written fiction can also be really powerful in helping us make these connections, along with doing this research of everyday people. The last thing I'll say, I think, is that it can be very difficult. Like, even with Kala Bagai's story, when we're forced to make it into a coherent narrative that people can repeat, a lot of details get left out. For instance, like, she actually was born in a Sikh family, and she married into a Hindu family, and she was married very young. She had she had 3 children by the time she moved here. And her story as a mother, a story as somebody who grew up in a Sikh family, a story of somebody who was came here from modern day Pakistan, the story of her as somebody who saw the ocean for the first time, the story of her wandering the Pacific Panama Pacific International Exposition, which was happening in San Francisco at that time. Like, there's so many, her wanting, she always took like a box of candy when she went to visit people. Like, there's so many like beautiful humanizing details that we often lose in sort of this grander story. So we are always figuring out how to tell stories at multiple levels, so that the stories of the people we say are they're human beings. They're full human beings with flaws and talents, but they're also part of this larger narrative that we connect to, of facing racism and having resisted racism. So I think even while doing the original research, that's something to keep in mind, because, like, what do you focus on? What do you look for? And when we're looking at old newspapers, we get a lot of those sort of juicy details, so to speak. So. Yeah.
So on that note, I think we'll wrap up for today. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and thank you for the great conversation, Barnali and Anirvan. So I'm not sure when the next live stream will be, but there will be another live stream probably next month. So stay tuned, and
I'm going to say one last thing, Chelsea, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Just, thank you, for including this as part of Women's History Month. And one thing, like I was saying, we didn't talk enough about is probably one of the reasons we chose Kala Bagai as somebody to nominate was also because she did her activism in a way that a lot of our mothers and grandmothers do activism. Not sort of always always the most loud or on the streets protesting, but really the sort of work of like community building, behind the scenes, making food for people. So we sort of wanted to honor that, because women's activism is often not seen because it's not loud. And so thank you for inviting us to share her story for Women's History Month. I think it's important for us to make those connections. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, so with that, we're wrapping up. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening if you're in India, or whenever you're watching this. Have a good whatever it is.